Hey gang, what's up? Welcome back to this week's edition of Advanced Bass Fishing. And man, I really appreciate you guys spending some time with me and watching today's seminar. I think that it's going to be well worth your time by the time you get through the end of it, because we're going to be talking about cold water crankbaits today. As far as crankbaits, when we're talking about cold water crankbaits, I'm talking about crankbait fishing pretty much from like the months of November into late March, something like that. Usually when the water temperatures are at their, the coldest parts of the year, give or take 10 or 15 degrees. And there's quite a bit to this, and a lot of myths and misconceptions that go with cold water cranking. So we're going to go over it in today's video and really dig into this pretty deep. What I wanted to do in this, as far as how we're going to start out, I've got 5 or 6 different crankbaits that I use in cold water, and each one of these crankbaits has sort of a different action, a different profile, a different application. So first of all, what we're going to do is I'm going to go through all my cold water crankbaits, and I'm going to explain to you the situations where they produce or outproduce different type of lures out there and why that is. And then second part of the video, we're going to go into the gear and the equipment, the line, rod and reels, retrieves, cadences, all that type of stuff on how to fish it. And then finally, as usual, the last part of our seminar, we'll get into the areas that you need to fish a cold water crankbait in. So I think that pretty excited about giving you guys this information. Also guys, just before we get started, just a couple quick housekeeping tips for advanced bass fishing. If you haven't had a chance, I'd like to invite you guys to subscribe. And also I'll put all of the baits that I'm fishing in the description here. And if you guys use my tackle warehouse link that I put in the description, if you bookmark it and use it for all your tackle purchasing, that's a great way to give back to the channel here. And in general, just if you guys could go in that description, use the links, and you want to, give back something, for this information, that's a really good way to do it. So much appreciated there. Okay guys, let's start digging into this. First of all, I'm going to run through my crankbait selection with this and sort of show you what I like here. Now, one of the things I'll say about cold water cranking is the evolution in how it really got to the point where it is right now was a slow process, because for many, many years, from, up until about probably the early 90s, people did not fish a crankbait in the wintertime very much, or in cold water. There was other lures out there that were dominating above that. Your jerk baits, your spoons, little hair jigs, little grubs, that type of stuff. That was traditionally associated with wintertime fishing. But as we became to know more about fish and understanding their moods and behaviors, it opened up this entire genre of cold water cranking that we're going to get into. Now, one of the things about it when you're talking about cold water cranking, and I'll get into this a little bit, there's 3 different phases of winter time. You've got early winter, which is usually, like November, December, something like that. You've got midwinter, which is like right now, January, first part of February. And then you have late winter, which is, or the early spring, late winter, whatever you want to call it, which is like February into early March, because depending upon the weather patterns and the part of the country that you're in, you can still have really cold water even in March like that. So when we're talking about a cold water crankbait, I'm talking about crankbaits that are fished when the water temperatures are under 55 degrees. I consider a cold water cranking scenario between, say, 40 to 55 degrees in the water temperature. Actually, probably more like 45 degrees, because once you get down below 45 degrees in the water temperature, crankbait fishing it gets a little bit slower. It's a little bit more difficult to catch them on it. Not to say you can't, because I've caught them on crankbaits, up when the water is, 42 degrees. But for the most part, 45 to 55 degrees is going to be your range. Now, when you're talking about that, there are different crankbaits that work better in specifically different water temperatures out there we're going to get into. But first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the baits I use. I'm going to show you the ones I like for cold water cranking. So first of all, guys, is everybody's old favorite is just the old Shad Rap. This bait has been around since the 70s. It is the staple cold water crankbait. Most people, when they think about cold water cranking, they think about a Rapala Shad Rap. The reason being is that you've got a real tight wiggle on the thing. It's quiet, it's balsa, it's finessey. One of the things about winter bass in general is they don't want big, loud, noisy baits. They like smaller baits that tend to be a little bit more diminutive And the Shad Rap, there's something about the depth it runs. This is a number 7 here, which is my favorite. Something about the depth it runs, the profile, the action, everything. It's very appealing to cold water bass with that. One of the other things before we get going farther here, guys, one of the most critical aspects of cold water cranking for the Shad Rap or whatever is you have to get these things where they suspend neutrally, because in cold water cranking, it's all about, you know, being able to fish it slow. And if you don't have these things weighted where they're neutral buoyant, if you fish it slow and you use a stop and go retrieve, it's going to float up and you're going to lose your depth and it's going to get shallower all the time. So make sure that you always weight them, you know, where they're neutral buoyant here. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But anyway, Shad Rap is everybody's favorite. And it works in pretty much wide range of conditions. When you're talking about these type of crankbaits working, a lot of it has to do with the water clarity in correlation with the water temperature. And in cold water cranking, you're not really fishing dirty water that much, unless maybe in the late winter. We'll get into it in a second. But for the most part, a Shad Rap is going to be for the water visibility that is over 2 foot and probably maxed out to about 6 feet. Once you get over 6 feet of visibility, the crankbaits lose their effectiveness. So for most of the crankbaits we're talking here, water visibility 2 to 6 feet is going to be ideal. Excuse me, accompanied up and paired up with the sunlight conditions and the light intensity. We'll get into that a little bit later too. But Shad Rap, first one. Second one with that, you've probably heard me talk about this some on the other channels, is a Lure Jensen Speed Trap. Now this is quite a bit different profile. You can see the difference. It's a lot wider profile. It looks a lot different here. But again, there's something, and this is one of those things about bass mood and personality, but this is something that's true. There's something about the action of a speed trap, which is a pretty tight wobbling crankbait. It's not a very wide wobbler, but there's something about the profile and the design and the vibration of the speed trap that cold water fish really like this, guys. They really, really like it a lot. And again, neutral buoyant with the weight on there. But the speed trap, guys, I've caught a ton of cold water fish on it. The next one, guys, is everybody's old favorite again, is the Wiggle Wart. Now the Wiggle Wart is going to be a little bit better when your water temperatures are a little warmer in the winter time. So for me, the Wiggle Wart is more for early winter or late winter. We're talking about when water temperatures are in the 50s. When water temperatures are like 50, 55 degrees, the Wiggle Wart is my number one choice. It is quite a bit different. It has a really wide wobble on it, and that's why it works a little bit better in that little bit warmer water. Wiggle Wart doesn't produce that good in off-colored water. Another thing about a Wiggle Wart, guys, is it works in probably the widest range of water clarity. It works in the clearest water you can find, and it works in, you know, the more stained area of it, down to 2 foot visibility. There's something about it. It will draw strikes from a lot of different water clarities based upon the color that you use. We'll get into colors a little bit more, but colors are critical too. But Wiggle Wart's definitely one of my favorites. The next one, guys, is a larger flat side. Like this is the Megabass Sonic side here. This is a flat-sided crankbait. It's got a tight wobble. That's one of the things that you're gonna see. The reoccurring theme of a cold water crankbait, with the exception of a Wiggle Wart, is they're going to have a tight wobble on it. But the Sonic side, it's got flat side on it. It's fairly narrow, tight wobble out there. And again, there's something about the profile of the bait, unique, just catches a lot of fish. It's a plastic bait, does float up a little bit on there. This is going to be another bait that I throw if the water has a little bit more color to it. The Sonic side doesn't run but maybe 4 foot deep at the most on 8-pound test line. So I'm not going to be using this in real clear water. It's going to be more in that sort of that 2 to 4 foot zone, depending upon, again, the sky conditions. And finally, guys, the last one is another flat side, but it's a homemade wooden flat side. But here's the difference. The Megabass Sonic side is a plastic bait. And this right here, this one's made by Laser Lure, but there's a lot of different companies out there. I think that Berkeley even has one. I think that Fritz side is a wooden crankbait. I'm not sure if it's balsa or what type of wood in it, but a wooden crankbait has a different action and a different vibration. And the wooden flat sides like this, guys, are the ones that I use in the most off-colored wintertime conditions. So if I've got water clarity that's down around 2 foot or maybe even 1.5 feet, and those water temperatures are, 40 to 50 degrees, that wooden flat side is going to get you more bites than anything. This is the number one type of a crankbait in the wintertime when you have the least amount of water visibility. And when I'm talking about water visibility, guys, you don't really want to fish. If you don't have at least, let's say, 15 inches of water visibility in the wintertime, it's not going to be that productive. So the homemade flat side, like the lazy lure, is going to be that for that 1.5 foot, 2 foot of water. And then if I had the clearest water that'll crankbait would work, it's going to be the wiggle wart. It gets down, this bait will get down close to 10 feet on 6-pound line. So that pretty much covers the range on it with that. So that's my lure selection with it, as far as that goes. Now, along with that, the color of the wintertime crankbait is also really critical. And the color is closely tied into a combination of the water temperature and the sky conditions, the light intensity and the sunlight conditions. And one of the things you guys have heard me talk about a lot here on Advanced Bass Fishing is you always hear me talking about water clarity. Guys, water clarity is you got to use it to your advantage, because water clarity tells you so much about how you need to be fishing, the colors you need to be fishing, the retrieves. There's so much information stacked within water clarity in correlation with water temperature. You always have to, when you're thinking in terms of water clarity and water temperature, you always have to think of it in terms of three. You have your water clarity, your water temperature, and your light intensity. All those factors combined add up to creating certain scenarios as far as the type of lure and how you need to fish it. So anyway, let's get into the colors a little bit. The colors are pretty basic for the most part. Three primary colors that I'm talking about here, and I'll get into conditions here also, is number one is the shad pattern. Now the shad pattern, guys, it's gonna work in a pretty wide range of conditions. I don't like a shad pattern if it's really clear. That's the only scenario that I don't. For the most part, I like a shad pattern when there's a little bit of color into the water. So for me, a shad pattern is going to be sort of when that water visibility is in that 2 to 3 foot range. And the thing about a shad pattern is it stands out. Even though it's a subtle color, it can stand out quite a bit based upon the type of shad pattern, because you can have a solid color like this, or you can have a more translucent looking color. I'll show you the difference here in the two shad patterns, and there's situations where each one of them is going to work over another. So say for example, here is a shad pattern, but it's more of a translucent. You can see my finger behind it here, and this is a solid pattern shad. So the translucent shad like this may work a little bit better in a little bit cleaner water or a little bit brighter day. Let's say, for example, if we've got water visibility of 2 feet and we've got a cloudy day, that's when I'm going to use the shad pattern with the solid finish on it, because it glows a little bit more, it's a little bit brighter. But say we have water visibility of 2.5 feet, and we got bluebird skies with no sun, with no clouds whatsoever, I may switch to the more translucent model, because the light intensity is a little bit brighter, and they like a little bit more subtle color if it's a little bit brighter light intensity. So you have two different type of shad patterns that's going to work there. Now, the next thing, and there's a lot of different variations, guys, like this matte shad here, this Megabass Sonic side here, this is a matte shad. You can see that's another shad pattern. It's just another variation with that. So you really have to pay close attention to those subtle changes in water clarity and light intensity. Also, you're going to find out about a shad pattern. The shad pattern will be your number one producer in the absolute coldest water that you fish. So in other words, if you feel that the lowest water temperature that you can catch a fish in your lake is 42, 43, 44 degrees, they're going to bite a shad pattern in that cold water better than any other color out there. Next one, guys, is the crawfish pattern. Now, the crawfish pattern, again, like the shad, it comes in a wide variety. You have like some type of a reddish orange crawl like this, and then you got, some type of a crawl like this that's a little bit, different looking. And then sometimes you can have, I don't have one out here, but you can have more of a translucent crawl. Let me pick one out here real quick. Of course, I don't have my translucent crawls out here, But anyway, what I was talking about, guys, you have, your bright colored craws, you have different shades with chartreuses in it, and then you've got some like, clear, like the green phantom or brown phantom wiggleworts, the cleaner water type stuff like that. The the crawdad patterns, guys, are a paradox a little bit because they work in the cleanest water and they also work in the dirtiest water. If you're using a shad or a crawdad pattern that's got orange and red on it like this, it's going to work down there in that dirtier water, that water visibility down to 1.5 feet or 2 foot of water, simply because it stands out, it silhouettes itself a little bit more, glows a little bit more. But if you're fishing those water clarities that are 4 foot or greater, something like that, let's see, I'm trying to think if I see my wigglewort box in there. Yeah, 1 second, guys, I'll get this. If you're fishing that water visibility that is like really clear, like down to 10 foot or so, the more translucent looking crawdads like this are a little bit better, and it gives you good. This one you can't really see it good and thing, but this is a translucent. If you hold it up to the light like this, I can see all the way through it. So the translucent crawdads are going to be the wintertime crankbait that works in the absolute clearest water conditions. I've caught fish on those see-through crawdad patterns in 8 to 10 foot of visibility, so pretty versatile with that. And then again, anytime you're talking about like the crawdad pattern in clear water or dirty water, always again consider the light intensity, because what happens is, let's say for example you have an ideal scenario where you have 4 foot of visibility and you have a crawdad pattern crankbait working. If you have 6 or 8 foot of visibility, yet you have clouds and wind, that same color can work. Or if you have a little bit dirtier water, like 2.5 or 3 foot of visibility, and you have a bright sky with not much wind, that same crawdad pattern can work. So a lot of it is just based upon all those variables there. So shad pattern, crawdad pattern, and the final one, guys, is going to be some type of a fire tiger like this. Fire tiger is an excellent color during cold water, but I'll tell you one thing about fire tiger, guys, it works better in later winter. So fire tiger is a color that I go to a lot, say in like the first part of February. And the thing about fire tiger, guys, it's just like what you think it would be. It's for more off-colored water, low light conditions. So the fire tiger is going to be a really good color on your cloudy days, days where you got water visibility sort of in that 2 to 3 foot range, and wind. If you have a windy day, one of those, say you're out there February, March, and you got one of those blustery, late winter days where the temperature is maybe 5-10 degrees above normal, you got a 15 to 20 mile an hour south wind, you got some clouds, those are conditions that make fish active even in the winter time. That's when the chartreuse is going to work good. It's an aggressive color. It'll catch fish under those situations there. Okay, so anyway, guys, that's a little bit about just the overview of the crankbaits, sort of when they work a little bit, the colors. Let's take a little break, and we're going to get back into some details of like some hooks and weighting it, and the lures, line, cadences, and retrieves. So we'll be right back in a second. Okay, guys, we're back for round 2 here. Now, in this segment, we're going to be talking a little bit about hooks, weighting the baits, and the rod and reels I use, the line size, retrieves, cadences, all that type of stuff to actually fish the lure here. So this is an important aspect of it. So first of all, guys, let's talk a little bit about hooks and weighting the bait. First thing, you really want to make sure if you have to replace the hooks on your baits, that you don't go too big. Now, say for example, see on the speed trap here, these hooks are too big on here. These are 2, I believe, number 4 Gamakatsus on there, a little bit too big. You want to always go smaller. Here's 2 number 5 on the Megabass Sonic side. You can see the difference as far as the size on them versus the lure on there. Now, this is really critical for a couple different reasons. First of all, it's all about penetration. In the wintertime, the fish they're not real aggressive. And when they bite a bait, a lot of times they sort of come up in slow motion and they just sort of nip at it like that. And if you've got a smaller hook on there, you're not concerned about the bite diameter on there as much you are about the diameter of the point. You want a small diameter point for maximum penetration, because guys, all you need to land a giant fish is all you need is one barb. If you get that barb in that fish in a hard part of that fish's mouth, that fish is not coming out. So you want a small diameter hook to maximize that penetration, because in this cold water cranking, you're using light line for the most part. So you don't have a lot of power to generate on a hook set. And if you use larger hooks, the larger diameter is going to make it more difficult for hook penetration. And on top of that, the larger hooks are going to kill the action of the bait. The larger hooks add weight to the bait. The more weight that you add to the bait, the less action that you have. It's going to affect that. So always try to go with smaller hooks a little bit. And my favorite, guys, I prefer that Gamakatsu G Finesse treble. Most of the time I'm using it in the number 5 size in the wintertime. It's been a really good hook for me. It's light, it's super sharp, and I've had some pretty good success with it. Now, you always want to make sure before you weight your lure, you always want to make sure that you've got the hooks on there that you want to use, because the hooks weigh differently. So you can't really weight the bait with a suspend strip until you have the right hooks on there. So get your hooks on first, and then you're going to go to your suspend strips. When you put these suspend strips on, guys, like on the Shad Rap, put them on right behind the front hook here, because when you put them on behind that front hook hanger, it's going to cause that bait to suspend perfect. It's not going to make it, cockeyed like that. It's going to get it to suspend like that. And then another thing, when you're putting the suspend strips on, these things have adhesive out of the factory, out of the package. They're not worth a crap, especially in cold water. If you put these things on in cold water, they usually fall off in just a few minutes. So make sure you get you a bottle of super glue the suspend strip onto the lure. And also sometimes I'll rough the bottom up, like with a piece of sandpaper, to make it hear better. And then if you have to put more than one suspend strip, make sure you super glue all the layers on there. That way it's not coming off. And when you're first putting it on, make sure you add it or it's a little bit heavy where the bait sinks. And then you can take a knife and you can trim the lead off with the knife to get it where it suspends just perfect like that. So that's the way to suspend them there. Now, the suspension, like we talked about earlier, is really critical in the wintertime, because you do not want these baits to float up, because you want to get them at the maximum depth. So say, for example, on this Shad Rap here, if you don't have it weighted, you're going to reel it down like this, and you're going to try to fish it slow. And if you try to use a stop and go retrieve, it's going to start floating up, and then you're going to lose your depth. So by neutral buoyant weighting these things, you'll get these things down to the deepest part. If you stop and go them at the deepest part, they're going to stay there, and they're going to keep digging down and keep getting a little bit deeper. And that's going to be the real key in the wintertime. Same with jerkbait fishing, is you got to get that crankbait down to its deepest part, when that water's cold. So now we're going to get into the rods a little bit, guys. Then got these sinuses or allergies I've had for the last couple of weeks, man. I've been coughing like crazy, so apologize for that. So anyway, guys, there's 2 different outfits that I use for the cold water cranking based upon the lures that I use. Now, when I'm using the Shad Rap or the balsa crankbait, which is light, and the wiggle wort, all these 3 here, I'm using them on a spinning rod. Now you might ask, guys, why do I use a spinning rod on a wiggle wort? I'll explain here in a second. But first of all, on those lighter crankbaits like that, in the wintertime, you're going to do a lot better on a spinning outfit, simply because you can make a longer cast, you can use lighter line, and you can put more of a finesse presentation on it. The rod I use is the Megabass Whip Snake, 6 foot 11 inch medium action. It's the same rod I use for my jerk baits. And also, guys, I'll put my rod links in the description here for my Tackle Warehouse link if you guys would like to try some of the rods that I use. But anyway, Megabass Whip Snake for those light ones. Now, what you want to do, make your cast out there based upon the type of structure that you're fishing. And as soon as you make your cast out there, make sure your rod tip is low to the water, because by keeping it low to the water, you're going to get that bait down there a lot deeper, a lot quicker. Now, if you're fishing a bait, like the flat side or the wiggle wort like that, one of the big things to consider out there is what I call the pull technique. So you cast it out there, reel it down 8 or 10 cranks to get it down to where you think it's the deepest it's going to be. And then once you get it down there, guys, and you're reeling it slow, and say you're just reeling it about like that, maybe stopping it once in a while. And once you get that bait down to the deepest part, instead of reeling, just pull the rod like that. And what happens is when you pull, the crankbait across the bottom like that, rather than reel it, it has a different action on there. It's hard to explain, but it creates a different action than if you're turning the reel handle. So once I get it down there to where that bait's hitting the bottom, I'm always stop and go, and then I pull a little bit, and I'll start reeling slowly a little bit like that. I'll maybe twitch the rod tip, pull it a little bit like that. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to keep the bait as slow as I can once it bounced the bottom at the deepest part. So say for example, on this flat side homemade here, this thing will run about 3 or 4 feet deep. Once I start knocking the bottom on the bottom at the maximum part on there, I want to keep it there as long as I can. And that's why the neutral buoyancy is really critical. And that's why the slow reel and the pull is real critical. Because the pull, when you're pulling it like that, you can control the rate and how far you pull it. Sometimes I may only pull it like 12 inches or so, and then twitch it a little bit, and then slowly start reeling, stop and go, slowly start reeling, stop and go. You don't want to just throw it out there and just reel like that in there. You can catch some fish doing that, but when you maximize that sweet spot, and the sweet spot is the deepest part that the crankbait's going to go, when you maximize the time frame where that bait is at the sweet spot, which is the lowest, that is when you're going to catch your big fish. Because when a crankbait goes down like this in the wintertime, you basically got very little odds of catching one on the way down. Once in a while, but not very often. And then once that bait gets down to the maximum part, based upon the length of your cast, your sweet spot may be anywhere between 3 or 4 or 5 feet in length, up to 20 feet in length, depending upon how long your cast is. That's going to be your high percentage area. And then once your bait starts coming up to the boat again, it gets back into a low percentage area. So try to keep it down there in that max zone as long as you can. And you do that by sort of finessing that bait with the rod tip and pulling it and stopping and starting it. That's how you keep it down there. Now, that's the rod I use for the lighter ones. Now for the heavier ones, when I'm talking about the Sonic side, which is a little bit heavier bait like this, speed trap, something like that, a little bit heavier, that's when I'm using the bait caster. And the bait caster I use for the heavier crankbaits, it's the Mega Bass. This is the Oroshi Jerkbait Special. It's a medium action, 6 foot 11 inch rod. It's got a really nice, medium action tip on it. Really good for those little bit heavier baits in there. Again, I'll put the Baitworks or the Tackle Warehouse link in the description. But guys, it's pretty much the same thing. Casting it out there, rod tip low to the water, getting it down. Once it gets down, I'm just doing my pull, slow reeling, stop and go, pulling like that. Same deal with the bait caster. The only reason that you're using a bait caster is simply because you're using a heavier lure, and sometimes you're using a little bit heavier line. Now, the line size is also critical too. I use nothing but Seagar and Vizex. I think that's the best. It's a fluorocarbon line. I think that's the best line you can use for the wintertime fishing. And the line tests that I use in the wintertime are on the lighter side. If I'm fishing, say for example, little flat side, something light, or maybe even a little wiggle wart like this where I want to get a lot of depth out of it, guys, a lot of times I'll fish it on 6-pound test line, because wiggle wart's a prime example. This bait, most people fish a wiggle wart like on 10-pound test line with the bait caster. And it's going to get down sort of in that 5-6 foot zone. Guys, I can take a wiggle wart and I can weight it with a suspend dot or suspend strip like that, put it on 6-pound test Seagar and Vizex with that whip snake spinning rod, and I can cast it over 25% further than you can on a bait caster. And with that 6-pound line, guys, you can knock the bottom in 10 foot of water on this wiggle wart. And you can get a wiggle wart down where where fish have never seen a wiggle wart before. So if I'm making like a long cast parallel down a rocky bank, I'll use 6 to 8 pound test line for a lot of these crankbaits. And then the heaviest that I'll use is something like, say on the speed trap like this. If I'm cranking water that's maybe a little bit more off colored, I may put it on 8 to 10 pound test line. I don't ever use anything over 10 pound test on any of these lures. There's no reason to. 10 pound test is about the max for anything. So 6, 8, 10 is going to be your prime line test on there. Okay, so anyway, guys, that's line, that's rod and reels. Take a little break and we're going to get back into the most important part of it, and that's where you want to fish these things, the areas which you need to look for. because if you're not fishing where the fish are at, you're not going to catch many. It doesn't matter how good your bait is. So we'll be right back. Okay guys, we're back with the final part of the video today. We're going to be talking about the areas that you need to fish the crankbaits in the wintertime. And it seems like, I know this is probably the most boring part of the seminar for some people, but guys, all the advanced bass fishing seminars I do, every aspect of it is important, but probably the most important aspects are always the last part, when you get into where you want to fish it at and what you want to look for, because you got to be around the fish, man. If you're not around the fish, you're not going to catch many, and you're not going to learn much about bass fishing unless you understand the seasonal movements and behaviors. And one of the great things about what I'm trying to do here on the advanced bass fishing is you're going to get a lot of seasonal information on how to find and locate fish. So that's going to really help you become a well-rounded angler as a result of that. Okay, so areas with that, guys. We're talking about areas I'm talking about traditional man-made lakes, because when you're talking about wintertime cranking, up north is pretty much out of the question, because it doesn't work up there very good. Water's frozen over. And if you're down south, that's also an outlier, because if you guys fish down like in Texas and Florida, you're not going to have the same type of cold water cranking. A lot of that cranking down there, if you got grass, is going to be something like with lipless crankbaits. You may fish some grass, some crankbaits over the top of grass, but I want to talk pretty much about normal man-made impoundments in today's video. So anyway, the first thing that you have to remember in the wintertime as far as what to look for is rock. Rock is everything. When you're talking about cold water cranking with the crankbaits I talked about, it's not about wood, it's not about shallow grass, although you can catch them out of shallow grass. It's all about rock. And every lake out there, every man-made lake out there has got rock in it. Now, the rock can be a lot of different stuff, just based upon, the type of lake that you guys have. It can be a bluff bank, it can be chunk rock, it can be rock transitions, it can be riprap, it can be, pea gravel bank, little bitty pea gravel rock. It can even be clay. It can even be clay with some mixed rock on it. But the main thing is you're concentrating around rock with that. And bass will live on rock in the wintertime shallower than what a lot of people realize, even in cold water. Yeah, you can catch fish on crankbaits around rock down when the water temperature's in the low 40s. So don't ever feel that there's not some fish up there to be caught in less than 10 foot of water in the wintertime, because there is all winter. Obviously, certain periods are going to be better than anything else. So number one thing when you're looking, it's all about rock, and your own lake is going to have a different rock composition on that. So when I'm talking about this in the last segment here, try to relate it to the lake that you fish and try to apply it to the rock that you do have. The next thing that you're going to find out about what to look for is you've got to be in the major or medium-sized creek arms. The reason you have to be in creek arms is because when you take a lake, let's just take an average 30,000 acre impoundment in the United States. In the wintertime, you're going to have a couple different populations of fish in that lake, regardless of the water clarity. You're going to have some fish that live deeper. You're going to have some fish that suspend. You're also going to have some fish that live in creeks, and the fish that live in those big creeks are resident fish. They stay there 12 months out of the year. They don't swim into the creek in the fall time of the year and swim out, different time of the year. They live in there, especially if it's a large creek. Now, on top of that, in general, for most lakes across the country, the resident bass that live in creeks are also shallower bass. And again, this is based upon where the creek is positioned at in the lake. The creeks that I like in the wintertime are creeks that are positioned sort of midway in the lake. I don't really like the creeks that are down on the lower end of the lake. I don't really like the creeks that are on the upper end. I like to concentrate my efforts on the creeks that are in the middle part of the lake. It doesn't have to be in the smack dab middle, but just that vicinity there. It seems like there's a bigger population of those winter fish in there. So by doing that, I've narrowed the lake down. So let's say, for example, if I've got a 30,000 acre lake that I'm fishing, I look at my map, I pick out one or two of the major creek arms that are sort of positioned in the mid part of the lake, and that is my lake for the day. And then I'll go into those particular areas, those creeks in there, and try to take a scouting run. In other words, when you pull back into some of those major creeks, now major creeks, guys, can be a lot of different sizes. They can be, a major creek can be sometimes, it can be 15 miles long, or it could be a mile long. It just depends on the lake that you're fishing. So it's all relative. But what you need to do is you need to sort of have a scouting run through that creek. So what I'll do is, if I don't know the lake, if I know the lake, it's no big deal. I know exactly where to go. But if I'm not familiar with the lake, I'll just sort of make a pass with my boat all through the creek, and I sort of get a feel for where the rock is at and what, the angle of the bank and the different size of rock and that type of stuff. The first thing that I do when I'm starting out looking, where I'm looking for these fish to be more than anything else, is in the back 2/3 of the creek. Now, I'm not talking about the very back of the creek. I'm talking about is if you run, say you have a creek that's 5 miles long, you run back into that creek maybe 2.5 or 3 miles and then start looking for cover there. And the cover that I want to look for is I want to look for the steepest banks that I can find in the wintertime. They don't have to be bluffs, but most lakes have a steep side in a creek and they got a flatter side. You definitely want to be on the steeper side. That steep side, it can be a channel bank, it could be a bluff bank, it could be a steep gravel bank, but you want to be on the banks that have the closest access to deep water. And again, I don't mean it has to drop off into deep water immediately, but you want to have the banks that have a relative close proximity to deeper water. And that deeper water can be relative to how deep the lake is. A lake like Bull Shoals in Arkansas, deep water is going to be 60, 70 foot. If you're on a creek in Lake Eufaula in Alabama, it's going to be a lot shallower. So it's all relative to that. So get into those steeper banks, and then what you want to do is you want to start paralleling the banks with those crankbaits. And your crankbait selection needs to be based upon those variables we talked about. You need to consider the water temperature, you need to consider the water clarity, you need to consider the time of day and the sunlight intensity. We talked about that in the first part of the seminar, and you can refer back to that. So once you've identified what you think the prime crankbait is and the prime color, that's when you want to position your boat parallel to the bank and start fishing parallel to the bank. Now, sometimes you're going to be right up against the bank, and other times you may be 10 foot off it. Depends on the slope of the bank, the angle, how it drops off. But that parallel cast is critical, because when you cast parallel, your bait is going to be in the strike zone a lot longer when you're cranking. And make no mistake about it, guys, the most important part as far as generating a crankbait strike in the wintertime is you got to be bumping the bottom. And I don't mean like bumping the bottom hard. I'm talking about you've got to be occasionally ticking a rock, or you got to keep that bait close to the bottom. It doesn't have to be digging in the bottom hard all the time, but you got to be hitting the bottom occasionally. If you're not hitting the bottom in a wintertime crankbait scenario, you're probably not going to catch many fish out there. So let your bank angle, the water clarity, and adjust your line size, adjust all that type of stuff, your casting length, to try to get that bait to be hitting the bottom. If you're not hitting the bottom, move in a little bit shallower, change your crankbait up, something like that. And in general, the crankbait that you need to select in the wintertime is relative to the water clarity, because if you have a lake that has real clear water, like water visibility over 6, 7, 8 foot of clarity, that's when like that little wooden flat side's not going to work that good. That's when you need to pick up the wiggle wart or possibly the shad wrap. So let your water clarity dictate that. Now, try that for a little bit, and based upon the success that you have in there, let that determine what your next move is. Pay close attention to little irregular features on the bank. You may have little indentations, you may have little rock outcroppings, you may have a point here and there. You may have, variations in the size of the rock. Pay close attention to that, especially when you catch a fish. When you catch your first fish on that crankbait, take some time to make a mental note of everything that took place when you caught that fish. Look at the water depth that you're in, look at the sunlight condition, try to remember the speed of retrieve of your bait, analyze the bank, look at the rock on the bank, look at it, how it drops off, and try to duplicate that. Now, if that's not working, the next thing you need to do is move out of the creek a little bit further. Instead of fishing, the upper 2/3 part of it, move to the mid part of the creek and repeat the same thing. Look for those little bit steeper banks with that. Repeat the same process in the mid part of the creek and at the mouth of the creek. Because generally what happens is in the winter time of the year, fish will use different parts of the creek at different times of the year. Now, there's no rule of thumb with that. There's a lot of variables that determine that, but from my fishing, what I have found is you'll have, say for example, when the water temperature is in the 50s in November, you'll have one part of the creek that simply has got more fish in it. And then when you have water temperatures in the 50s, like in February, say in November, the water temperatures are dropping down into the 50s, and in February, the water temperatures rising up into the 50s. Those fish are usually going to be in a different part of the creek. And there's no set rule on that. It's almost like you just have to fish through there until you figure out what the best part of the creek is. That's one of the things about bass don't read textbooks, so I can't tell you guys, okay, November 25th, you need to be in the back 2/3 of the creek. It could be the front. You never know what the deal is with that. You just have to experiment. You have to try it for a little bit, try it for 30, 40 minutes. If it doesn't work, go to a different part of the creek with that. And eventually you're going to run into him with that. Now, another thing that you have to, pay close attention to is once you get more familiar with it, you'll be able to look at the sky conditions. Like you'll be able to get out there and you'll be able to, notice the wind speed, the wind direction, the sunlight angle, and all that type of stuff. And you'll be able to make a little bit better determination. So let me give you an example about this. When you're in a major creek, there are different water clarities in that creek usually. Most of the time, the lower end of the creek or the creek closest to the main lake is going to have a little bit cleaner water than the back part of the creek. And when you have the cleaner water, normally the cleaner water is going to be better in the coldest water temperatures and vice versa. But as a paradoxical reference here, is if you've had a lot of rain, in the area that you're fishing, the backs of the creeks are going to have the dirty water initially, and then they are going to clean up quicker, and then eventually the mouth of the creek is going to be dirtier. So in some scenarios, the mouth of the creek towards the main lake is going to have the dirty water that gets pushed out, and the cleaner water is going to be in the back of the creek as it gets flushed out from the back, and everything starts to settle down a little bit. So you have to pay close attention, to where that is as well. But the main thing, guys, is you just have to cover water until you isolate what those fish are on. And there's always some type of bank that's better than others. I mean, it has to do with bank angle more than anything else. It has to do with the slope of the bank, the size of the rock, and usually you can reproduce that, when you're winter cranking with that. But that's what I look for, guys. That's, anytime from November to March. I mean, you're going to find me in the major creeks. You're going to find me all over that creek. You're going to find me parallel on the banks. You're going to find me fishing weighted crankbaits and the ones that I talked about there. It's a really good way to catch them. And overall, when you're talking about the quality of fishing in the wintertime, when you're cold water cranking, your fishing is always going to be better normally like in February and March. When the fishing is always going to be a little bit slower, like in November and December and January on a crankbait, you're still going to be able to catch some, but you're going to notice a tremendous increase in the size of the fish you catch and the number of fish you catch once that water temperature starts creeping up a little bit in late winter. Normally what you have in most parts of the country, now this is affected by weather patterns, because weather patterns fluctuate and they change, at will. But by the time February rolls around, the daylight hours are starting to get a little bit longer, and you're starting to notice a little bit of an increase in your water temperature. And when I'm talking about an increase in the water temperature, I'm not talking about, say, for example, you get a day that's 75 degrees for maybe you get a warm trend that's 75 degrees for a couple days, and the shallows start warming up. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the water temperature that you find at first thing in the morning out on the main lake or the deeper water. That's the true water temperature. But in February, once you start noticing that water temperature creeping up maybe say 1 degree a week or something like that, 1 or 2 degrees a week, that is when you're going to start noticing a movement of fish into that zone that you can catch them on those crankbaits. Ideally for me, it's like when I start noticing like the second week of February and I go to the lake and those water temperatures, I notice them getting 45, 46, 47, 48, 49. And once they start hitting 50 degrees, which is usually around February, March in a lot of part of the country, that is your key area. That's going to be your prime time for the wintertime cranking out there. That's when you're going to catch the most and the biggest fish. But anyway, guys, that's just overall, just going to give you guys a baseline of what to look for wintertime cranking. It's a great way to catch them. Another thing about that, guys, is the bites that you get in the wintertime are very soft. Most of the time, you don't feel anything other than it just gets heavy. So that's why you really want to use those lighter fluorocarbon lines and those lighter tipped rods that I'm talking about. It gives you increased sensitivity with that. So hope it helps you guys catch some, guys. Just pull out some crankbaits. It's a fun way to catch them, and hope it just adds some more tools to your arsenal. So we'll see you guys next week.